The sun was just beginning its slow ascent, casting a soft golden glow across the sprawling estate of Richard Harmon. The mansion stood like a monument to success, its grand pillars and wide marble steps announcing the wealth and power of the man who lived there. The manicured garden shimmered with dew, and the quiet hum of sprinklers was the only sound breaking the stillness of the early morning. It was a scene of perfect tranquility, until Richard, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, stepped out of his front door and froze in his tracks. From the corner of his eye, Richard spotted something unusual. His sleek black Mercedes, parked under the ancient oak tree that shaded his circular driveway, wasn't empty. There, slumped in the driver's seat, was the silhouette of a man, his head tilted back against the headrest, his body still, as if he were deep in sleep. Richard's brow furrowed. He wasn't a man easily rattled, but the sight of a stranger in his car sent a prickle of unease down his spine. He approached cautiously, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel. With each step, he took stock of the situation. The man in the car wasn't moving, but he wasn't dead either. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. His clothes were tattered, his sneakers worn down to threads, and his hair stuck out in wild tufts. Richard noticed a small bundle of belongings tucked under the passenger seat. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just sleeping here by chance. Richard pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen to call security. But something stopped him. As a self-made man who had once clawed his way out of poverty, Richard wasn't a stranger to hardship. He could recognize desperation when he saw it, and the man in his car radiated like a beacon. "No," Richard muttered to himself, slipping the phone back into his pocket. He would handle this his way. Gripping the door handle, Richard yanked it open. The man inside jolted awake with a start, his eyes wide with fear as he scrambled to sit upright. I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice cracking as he raised his hands defensively. "I didn't mean any harm. Please, don't call the police." Richard's sharp gaze bore into the man, but there was no anger in his expression, only curiosity. "Relax," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "You're not in trouble. Yet. But I need some answers. Who are you? And why are you in my car?" The young man hesitated, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "My name's Ethan," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know where else to go. I've been on the streets for weeks. Last night, I just needed somewhere safe to sleep." Richard's posture softened slightly as he studied Ethan more closely. The kid couldn't have been more than 25. His face was gaunt, his skin pale, and his clothes hung loosely on his thin frame. The look in his eyes, equal parts shame and exhaustion, struck a chord in Richard that he hadn't felt in years. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories like this one. Enjoy the rest of the tale. "You chose the wrong car for that," Richard said, crossing his arms. Ethan flinched, clearly expecting an explosion of anger, but it didn't come. Instead, Richard leaned against the doorframe, his curiosity overtaking his irritation. "Tell me, Ethan, what's your story? How does someone like you end up sleeping in someone else's driveway?" Ethan hesitated, his hands clutching the fabric of his worn hoodie. He didn't want to tell this man, this obviously wealthy, powerful man, about his failures. But there was something about Richard's tone, something that felt less like judgment and more like genuine interest. With a deep breath, he began to speak. "I worked at a factory," Ethan said, his voice shaking slightly. "It wasn't much, but it paid the bills. Then it shut down, just like that. They didn't even give us notice. I couldn't find another job fast enough. My landlord, well, he wasn't the understanding type. I got evicted, and everything just spiraled from there." He looked down at his lap, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I didn't want to be a burden to anyone, so I just disappeared." Richard listened in silence, his sharp mind piecing together the fragments of Ethan's story. It was a tale he heard before, but this time it felt personal. He saw himself in the young man, years ago, before his own rise to success, when he had been scraping by, wondering if life would ever give him a break. "You've had a rough time," Richard said finally, his tone more contemplative than pitying. "But that doesn't excuse trespassing. You can't just crawl into someone's car and hope for the best." "I know," Ethan said quickly, his voice tinged with desperation. "I know it was wrong. I just didn't know what else to do. I'll leave. I swear I'll leave, and you'll never see me again." But as Ethan moved to step out of the car, Richard raised a hand, stopping him. "Not so fast," he said. Ethan froze, confusion flickering across his face. Richard tapped his fingers against the car door, his mind racing. He could call the police, have the kid carted off, and wash his hands of the whole thing. But something about that felt wrong. Too easy, too cold. Richard had learned long ago that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the easy thing. "Here's what we'll do," Richard said, his voice steady. "You're going to come inside, have some breakfast, and tell me more about how you ended up here. After that, we'll figure out what comes next. Deal?" Ethan blinked, stunned. You're not calling the cops?" Richard smirked faintly. "Not unless you give me a reason to. Now, are you coming? Or do I have to drag you inside?" Ethan hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to run. But something in Richard's eyes, something that felt oddly sincere, made him nod. "Okay," he said softly. "Deal." As the two walked toward the mansion, Ethan couldn't help but wonder what he had just gotten himself into. Little did he know, this moment would change his life in ways he never could have imagined. Ethan followed Richard up the stone steps of the massive mansion, his legs feeling like lead with every step. The sheer size and grandeur of the house made him feel even smaller than he already did. Towering marble columns framed the entrance, and the double doors, crafted from dark, polished wood with intricate carvings, swung open with an eerie silence, as if the house were waiting to swallow him whole. "Come on," Richard said, gesturing for Ethan to step inside. Ethan hesitated, his hand gripping the strap of his tattered backpack. It had been weeks since he'd been in a home, let alone one like this. The thought of stepping into such a pristine space while wearing his dirty, worn clothes filled him with shame. "I don't think," Ethan began, but Richard cut him off with a sharp glance. "You're already here. No point in turning back now." Reluctantly, Ethan stepped over the threshold, his sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished marble floor. The foyer was breathtaking. A grand staircase swept up to the second floor, its banisters gleaming like they were freshly polished every hour. Chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, their crystals catching the sunlight streaming through a massive stained-glass window. The air smelled faintly of lemon and lavender, a stark contrast to the cold, damp streets Ethan had grown used to. As Ethan stood frozen in place, unsure of where to look or what to do, a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Harmon, good morning. Is there anything you need?" Ethan turned to see a woman in a crisp uniform standing a few steps away, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her gaze flickered to Ethan, her professional demeanor faltering just slightly before she caught herself. "Maria," Richard said, his voice calm but commanding. "Can you prepare some breakfast for our guest here? Something hearty. He looks like he could use it." Maria's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. "Of course, sir. Right away." Ethan's cheeks burned with embarrassment. He didn't belong here, and he knew it. Every part of this house, from the spotless floors to the expensive artwork on the walls, screamed that he was out of place. He looked down at his scuffed shoes, avoiding Richard's gaze. "I don't want to be any trouble," he mumbled. Richard, who had already started walking toward the dining room, stopped and turned to face Ethan. "If you were trouble, you wouldn't be standing here," he said simply. "Now, sit down, eat, and stop apologizing for existing." The dining room was just as overwhelming as the rest of the house. A long, polished table stretched nearly the entire length of the room, with high-backed chairs lining both sides. A vase filled with fresh lilies sat at the center, their scent subtle but calming. Ethan hesitated at the doorway, unsure where to sit. "Pick a chair, any chair," Richard said, gesturing vaguely at the table. Ethan slid into the seat nearest to the door, trying to make himself as small as possible. Maria appeared moments later with a tray laden with food: scrambled eggs, toast, bacon, fresh fruit, and a steaming pot of coffee. Ethan's stomach growled loudly at the sight, and he quickly looked away, embarrassed. Maria set the tray down and gave him a kind smile. "Eat," she said gently, before leaving the room. Ethan hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for a piece of toast. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had a proper meal, and the first bite nearly brought tears to his eyes. The buttery warmth of the toast and the saltiness of the bacon felt like a lifeline, grounding him in this surreal moment. Richard watched him in silence for a few minutes, sipping his coffee. Finally, he spoke. "So, Ethan, tell me more about how you ended up in my driveway. I know you lost your job and your home, but what about before that? What's your story?" Ethan swallowed hard, the toast feeling heavy in his throat. "There's not much to tell," he said, his voice low. "I grew up in a small town. My parents weren't around much, so I learned to take care of myself early. I didn't go to college, couldn't afford it. I got the factory job right out of high school and thought I'd be there forever." He paused, staring down at his plate. "Then the factory closed, and, well, you know the rest." Richard nodded thoughtfully, his expression unreadable. "And what did you do when the factory shut down? Did you look for other jobs? Try anything else?" "Of course I did," Ethan said, his voice defensive. "I applied everywhere I could think of: grocery stores, warehouses, restaurants. Nobody was hiring, and the few places that wouldn't take someone like me. No degree, no connections. It didn't take long before I ran out of money. After that," he trailed off, his shoulders slumping. "It's hard to think about what's next when you're just trying to survive another day." The room fell silent, the weight of Ethan's words hanging heavy in the air. Richard leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze fixed on Ethan. "You're right," he said finally. "It is hard, but surviving isn't the same as living. And if you want to get back to living, you need to start thinking about what's next." Ethan looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" Richard set his coffee cup down with a deliberate clink. "I mean, you can't keep running from your problems and hoping they'll solve themselves. You need to face them head-on. And sometimes that means accepting help when it's offered." Ethan frowned, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "Help? From you?" Richard smirked faintly. "Don't look so surprised. I've been where you are, Ethan. Maybe not in the exact same way, but close enough. And I know how hard it is to pull yourself up when the world seems determined to keep you down. That's why I'm offering you something most people wouldn't. A chance. A chance for what?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with both hope and doubt. "To prove that you're more than your circumstances," Richard said simply. "To show me and yourself that you can take what life throws at you and turn it into something better. But it won't be easy, and I won't go easy on you." Ethan stared at him, trying to process what he was hearing. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." Richard's smirk softened into something closer to a smile. "Because someone once did it for me, and because I have a feeling about you, Ethan. You may have lost your way, but you haven't lost your potential. So, what do you say? Are you ready to stop surviving and start living?" Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He didn't know if he was ready, but he knew he couldn't go back to the streets, not after this. "I'll try," he said finally, his voice trembling. Richard nodded, satisfied. "Good. Then we'll start tomorrow. Be here at 7 a.m. sharp." As Ethan left the mansion that day, the morning sun warming his face, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Little did he know, Richard's offer was more than just a job. It was a test, and the challenges ahead would push him to his limits, forcing him to discover who he truly was. The morning air was crisp and cool as Ethan walked up the mansion's long driveway. His stomach churned with a mix of anxiety and determination. He had barely slept the night before, his mind racing with thoughts of what Richard had planned for him. Was this really a chance to change his life, or was he setting himself up for another disappointment? Either way, there was no turning back now. He arrived at the grand front door at exactly 6:55 a.m., his tattered shoes scuffing against the pristine stone steps. Maria greeted him at the door, her warm smile a small comfort in the intimidating space of the mansion. "Good morning, Ethan," she said, gesturing for him to come inside. "Mr. Harmon is waiting for you in the gardens. Follow me." The gardens were a sight to behold, even more stunning in the soft morning light. Rows of perfectly trimmed hedges framed colorful flower beds that looked like something out of a painting. In the distance, Richard stood near a shed, his sleeves rolled up and a shovel in hand. The sight caught Ethan off guard. He had expected Richard to be waiting in a suit, issuing commands from afar, not standing in the dirt with tools. "Morning, Ethan," Richard called out, his voice brisk and businesslike. "Glad to see you're on time. That's a good start." Ethan nodded, unsure of what to say. Richard pointed to a stack of supplies next to the shed, shovels, gloves, and several young trees in burlap sacks. "Today, we're planting these along the property line. You'll be working alongside me. Let's see what you've got." Ethan blinked in surprise. Planting trees? This wasn't what he had expected. He had pictured something more polished, more in line with the grandeur of the mansion. But Richard was already moving, grabbing a shovel and motioning for Ethan to follow. Without another word, Ethan picked up a pair of gloves and a shovel, determined not to let his confusion show. The first hole was tougher than Ethan anticipated. The ground was hard, packed tightly from years of being untouched. His arms ached as he dug, sweat quickly soaking through his shirt despite the cool morning air. Richard worked beside him, his movements steady and practiced. For a man who had built an empire, he seemed oddly at home in the dirt. "Keep your back straight," Richard said, his tone more instructional than critical. "You'll last longer that way." Hours passed, and the work only got harder. Each hole had to be dug deep enough to support the young trees, and the process of planting required careful attention to detail. Ethan's hands, already calloused from weeks on the streets, began to blister under the strain. He gritted his teeth, refusing to let the pain slow him down. Richard, noticing Ethan's struggle, offered a bottle of water. "Don't kill yourself on the first day," he said, his tone carrying a hint of amusement. Ethan took the bottle gratefully, gulping down the water before wiping his forehead with his sleeve. "Why trees?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "What does this have to do with the job you mentioned?" Richard leaned on his shovel, his gaze thoughtful as he looked out at the property line. "Planting a tree is about more than just digging a hole," he said. "It's an investment in the future. It takes patience, care, and a willingness to nurture something that won't pay off immediately. Most people aren't willing to put in that kind of work. I needed to see if you were." Ethan frowned, feeling a mix of frustration and curiosity. "So this is a test?" he asked, his tone more accusatory than he intended. Richard didn't flinch. "Everything is a test," he said simply. "The question is whether you pass or fail." As the day wore on, Ethan began to notice small details about Richard. Despite his wealth, there was a practicality to the man, a willingness to get his hands dirty that didn't align with the stereotypes Ethan had built in his mind. Richard wasn't just watching him work. He was working alongside him, matching him shovel for shovel. It was both humbling and motivating. By late afternoon, the last tree was in the ground. Ethan stepped back, his muscles screaming in protest, but his heart swelling with a sense of accomplishment. The row of young trees stood tall and proud, a testament to the day's labor. Richard clapped him on the shoulder, his grip firm, but not overly familiar. "Not bad," he said, nodding toward the line of trees. "You stuck out. That says something." Ethan couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride. For months, he had felt like a failure, every day a reminder of what he had lost. But today, he had done something tangible, something real. "Thanks," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. Richard smirked. "Don't thank me yet." This was the easy part. Ethan's stomach twisted at the words, but he didn't ask what was coming next. He knew better than to expect an answer. As they walked back toward the mansion, Richard spoke again, his tone more reflective. "You know, Ethan, most people think success is about talent or luck. But it's not. It's about resilience. The ability to get back up every time life knocks you down. That's what I'm looking for in you." Ethan nodded, his thoughts swirling. Resilience. It was a word he hadn't associated with himself in a long time, but maybe, just maybe, it was something he could still find within. By the time they reached the front steps, the sun was beginning to set, casting the mansion in a warm, golden glow. Maria greeted them at the door, her expression softening as she saw Ethan's exhausted but satisfied face. "Dinner will be ready soon," she said, her voice kind. Ethan glanced at Richard, unsure if he was invited to stay. Richard nodded. "You've earned it," he said. "Get cleaned up, and we'll talk more over dinner." As Ethan stepped into the cool interior of the mansion, his body aching and his mind racing, he couldn't shake the feeling that today had been about more than planting trees. It was a glimpse of something bigger, a chance to prove, not just to Richard, but to himself, that he was capable of more than he had ever believed. And while the road ahead remained uncertain, one thing was clear. This was just the beginning. Ethan arrived at the mansion the next morning with his muscles still aching from the previous day. Despite the soreness, there was a strange sense of anticipation bubbling inside him. Yesterday had been grueling, but for the first time in months, he had felt a sense of purpose, a small but undeniable spark that reminded him of the man he once hoped to become. He didn't know what Richard had in store for him today, but he was determined to show up and give his all. Maria greeted him at the door with her usual warm smile. "Good morning, Ethan," she said, handing him a steaming cup of coffee. "Mr. Harmon is waiting for you in the study." The study was an entirely different world compared to the gardens. It was a room of quiet power and intellect, with walls lined from floor to ceiling with bookshelves holding leather-bound tomes. The air smelled faintly of aged wood and parchment, and the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminated Richard, who was seated behind a massive oak desk. He looked up as Ethan entered, his sharp eyes studying the young man as if trying to gauge his readiness. "Morning," Richard said, motioning for Ethan to sit in the leather chair across from him. Ethan hesitated for a moment before settling into the seat, his back straight and his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Yesterday was about work," Richard began, leaning back in his chair. "About seeing if you had the grit to push through discomfort and follow through on a task. Today, we're going to shift gears. It's time to see if you can handle responsibility." Ethan frowned slightly, unsure of what Richard meant. "Responsibility for what?" he asked cautiously. Richard didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick envelope, setting it down on the desk between them. "Inside this envelope is $5,000, he said matter-of-factly. Ethan's eyes widened, his heart skipping a beat. "It's not for you," Richard added quickly, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It's for someone else." Ethan's confusion deepened. "Someone else?" he echoed. Richard leaned forward, his tone growing serious. "There's a woman named Claire. She runs a small diner downtown, a place I used to go to all the time when I was building my business. That diner has been struggling lately. Bills piling up, staff quitting, the works. I want you to take this money to her, no strings attached. But I'm not sending you there just to deliver cash. I'm sending you to observe, to listen, and to learn. Learn what? Ethan asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. Perspective, Richard said simply. You'll learn more about people, about resilience, and about what it takes to survive when everything seems stacked against you. And maybe, just maybe, you'll learn a little about yourself. Ethan stared at the envelope, his mind racing. The weight of the task wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just about handing over money. It was about proving to Richard, and perhaps to himself, that he could be trusted to handle something bigger than manual labor. After a moment, he nodded. I'll do it, he said firmly. Richard's smirk softened into something closer to a smile. Good, he said, sliding the envelope across the desk. Claire's Diner is on Maple Avenue. You'll find her there most mornings. Take your time. Listen to her story. And when you're done, come back and tell me what you learned. The diner was a far cry from the polished elegance of Richard's mansion. It was small, with faded red booths and a worn counter where customers sipped coffee out of mismatched mugs. A bell jingled softly as Ethan pushed open the door, and the smell of frying bacon and fresh pancakes greeted him like a warm embrace. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a friendly smile. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and her apron was stained from the morning rush. Ethan knew instantly that this had to be Claire. Morning, she said cheerfully, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Grab a seat anywhere. Coffee's fresh. Ethan slid into a booth near the window, his gaze wandering around the room. There were only a handful of customers, a young couple sharing a plate of pancakes, an older man reading the newspaper, and a teenager in a uniform who looked like he was on his way to work. The place had a cozy charm, but it was clear that it had seen better days. Claire approached his table with a pot of coffee. "What can I get you?" she asked, pouring him a cup before he could respond. "Actually," Ethan said, his nerves making his voice shake slightly, "I'm not here to eat. I came to see you." Claire raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Me? What for?" Ethan hesitated, then pulled the envelope out of his pocket and set it on the table. "I was sent here by someone who wanted to help," he said. "This is for you." Claire stared at the envelope, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "Is this some kind of joke?" she asked, her voice cautious. "No joke," Ethan assured her. "It's real. He knows about your diner, about the challenges you've been facing. He wanted to help." Claire sank into the booth across from him, her hands trembling as she opened the envelope. When she saw the money inside, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Who would do something like this?" Ethan smiled faintly. "A man who believes in second chances," he said simply. For the next hour, Ethan listened as Claire poured out her story. She had inherited the diner from her father, who had built it from the ground up. It had once been the heart of the neighborhood, but over the years, competition and rising costs had taken their toll. Claire had poured everything she had into keeping the doors open, but it was becoming harder and harder to make ends meet. As she spoke, Ethan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of connection to her struggle. Her story mirrored his own in many ways, both of them fighting against the odds, trying to hold on to something they believed in. By the time he left the diner, Ethan felt like he had gained more than he had given. He had seen resilience up close, and it had left an indelible mark on him. When Ethan returned to the mansion that evening, Richard was waiting for him in the study. "How did it go?" he asked, his tone calm, but expectant. Ethan set the now empty envelope on the desk and met Richard's gaze. "It went well," he said. "She was grateful, overwhelmed really. But more than that, I think she was reminded that she's not alone, that there are people who care." Richard nodded, a satisfied expression crossing his face. "And what about you? What did you learn?" Ethan hesitated, then spoke from the heart. "I learned that everyone is fighting a battle, even if it's not obvious. And I learned that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can mean the world to someone." Richard leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes studying Ethan. "Good," he said after a moment. Then you're starting to understand. But don't get too comfortable. The real work is just beginning. Ethan left the study that night feeling both exhausted and inspired. The weight of the day's events lingered in his mind, but so did the realization that he was capable of more than he had ever given himself credit for. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The next morning, Ethan was called back to the study, unsure of what to expect. The previous day's events at the diner still lingered in his mind. Claire's story, her resilience, and her gratitude had stirred something in him. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something bigger, something meaningful. But as he stepped into study, the serious expression on Richard's face told him that today would bring a new challenge. "Morning, Ethan," Richard greeted, motioning for him to sit. Ethan obeyed, noticing the usual clutter of documents and ledgers spread across the desk. But one item stood out, a small black safe, its surface scuffed from years of use. "Yesterday was about observing," Richard began, "about seeing the value in other people's struggles. Today, we're moving up a level. It's time to test your decision-making." Ethan's brows furrowed in confusion. "What kind of decision?" he asked cautiously. Richard reached into his desk drawer and pulled out another envelope, this one thicker than the last. He set it on the desk between them. "Inside this envelope is $10,000, Richard said, his voice calm but deliberate. "You'll take this money and decide what to do with it. The catch is, I'm not giving you an address or a name this time. This isn't about following instructions. It's about taking initiative." Ethan stared at the envelope, his pulse quickening. "You're just giving it to me?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Richard's lips curled into a faint smile. "Not quite. I'm entrusting you with it. There's a difference." He leaned forward, his sharp gaze locking with Ethan's. "This money isn't yours to keep, but it is yours to manage. You'll have 24 hours to find someone, or something, that truly needs it. No rules, no restrictions, but I'll expect a full explanation when you return. Understood?" Ethan nodded slowly, his mind already racing. The weight of the envelope felt heavier than its contents. This wasn't just about the money. It was about trust, responsibility, and judgment. "Understood," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves coursing through him. Ethan spent the first few hours wandering through the city, the envelope tucked securely inside his jacket. He passed by familiar sights, the park where he had slept on benches, the soup kitchen where he'd lined up for meals, the alleyways that had once been his refuge. Everywhere he looked, he saw a need, but the sheer volume of it overwhelmed him. How could he possibly decide who deserved this money the most? His first stop was the soup kitchen. The line stretched around the block, a mix of families, veterans, and lone individuals waiting patiently for their turn. Ethan approached the volunteers, a group of older women working tirelessly behind the counter. "Excuse me," he said, pulling one of them aside. "Do you know the biggest challenge this place faces?" The woman, a kind-looking lady with silver hair, wiped her hands on her apron and sighed. "Funding," she said simply. "We rely on donations to keep the doors open, but it's never enough. There's always more need than we can meet." Ethan's hand brushed against the envelope in his pocket, but he hesitated. While the soup kitchen was clearly deserving, he couldn't shake the feeling that his decision had to be more personal, more intentional. His next stop was a rundown apartment building on the edge of downtown. The peeling paint and broken windows told a story of neglect, and the faint cries of children could be heard through the thin walls. Ethan knocked on a few doors, introducing himself awkwardly and asking about the residents' needs. At one door, a young mother with a baby on her hip explained how she was working 3 jobs just to afford rent. "It's never enough," she said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "But what choice do I have? This is the only place I can afford." Ethan felt a pang of guilt as he walked away. There were so many people who needed help, and the weight of choosing just one was beginning to feel unbearable. As the sun began to set, Ethan found himself back at the park where he had spent so many nights. He sat on a bench, watching the world go by. Children played on the swings, their laughter echoing through the crisp evening air. Homeless men and women huddled on the edges of the park, their eyes wary but resigned. One man in particular caught Ethan's attention, a veteran sitting near the fountain, his face weathered and his hands trembling as he clutched a cardboard sign that read, "Will work for food." Ethan approached him cautiously. "Hey," he said softly. The man looked up, his eyes dull but curious. "Mind if I sit?" The man shrugged, and Ethan took a seat beside him. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. "Jim." The man replied, his voice rough. "What do you want?" "Just to talk," Ethan said, pulling the envelope out of his jacket. Jim's eyes flicked to it, his expression unreadable. "I have something that might help you, but I need to understand your story first." Jim hesitated before speaking. He told Ethan about his time in the military, about the injuries that left him unable to work, and about the system that had failed him when he needed it most. "I've been out here for 5 years," he said, his voice cracking. "You learn to survive, but you forget what it feels like to live." Ethan's chest tightened. Jim's words struck a chord deep within him, echoing the hopelessness he had felt during his own darkest moments. Without another thought, Ethan opened the envelope and handed it to Jim. "This is for you," he said simply. Jim's hands trembled as he took the money, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because someone once helped me," Ethan replied. "And because I believe you deserve a chance to start over." When Ethan returned to the mansion that night, Richard was waiting for him in the study. "Well," Richard asked, his tone calm but expectant, "what did you decide?" Ethan recounted his day, his voice steady but emotional. He told Richard about the soup kitchen, the young mother, and finally about Jim. "I gave it to a veteran," Ethan said. "Someone who's been forgotten by the world but hasn't given up on himself. I thought he needed it the most." Richard listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Ethan finished, Richard nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "You made a decision, and you stuck with it. That's what matters. The world is full of hard choices, Ethan. It's not about finding the perfect answer. It's about having the courage to act." Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. The weight of the day's burden lifted, replaced by a newfound sense of purpose. As he left the study that night, he realized that Richard's tests weren't just about proving himself. They were about discovering who he truly was. And with each step forward, Ethan felt closer to the man he wanted to become. The following morning, Ethan arrived at the mansion with a renewed sense of determination. The events of the previous day had left him both drained and inspired. Trust was a heavy burden, but it was one he was beginning to understand. The responsibility of deciding how to use the money had taught him a valuable lesson. Sometimes, making a choice was more important than finding the perfect solution. Maria greeted him at the door as usual, but there was an unusual sparkle in her eyes. "Good morning, Ethan," she said, her tone warmer than usual. "Mr. Harmon is waiting for you in the library today." The library was a part of the mansion Ethan hadn't seen before. As Maria led him through the hallways, he couldn't help but notice the change in atmosphere. The house seemed quieter, almost reverent, as they approached a set of double doors. When Maria pushed them open, Ethan's breath caught. The library was nothing short of magnificent. Shelves lined every wall, stretching all the way to the ceiling, filled with books of every size and color. A massive globe stood in the corner, and a crackling fireplace cast a warm glow over the room. In the center of it all was Richard, seated in a high-backed leather chair, a book resting on his lap. He looked up as Ethan entered, a small smile playing on his lips. "Ethan," Richard said, closing the book and setting it aside. "Come in. We have much to discuss." Ethan stepped into the room, feeling a mix of awe and apprehension. The library felt like a sacred space, a reflection of Richard's intellect and curiosity. "Morning," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. Richard gestured for Ethan to sit in the chair across from him. Once Ethan was seated, Richard leaned forward, his expression serious. "You've been doing well," he began. "Better than I expected, if I'm being honest. But we've reached a point where it's time for you to learn the truth." "The truth?" Ethan echoed, his brow furrowing in confusion. Richard nodded, his sharp gaze unwavering. "About why I'm doing all of this. Why I gave you a chance. Why I've been testing you." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "I see something in you, Ethan. Something I haven't seen in a long time. But before I explain, I need you to understand one thing. None of this is about charity. This is about legacy." Ethan tilted his head, unsure of what Richard meant. "Legacy?" "Yes," Richard said, his voice firm. "Let me tell you a story." Richard leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant as he began to speak. "When I was your age, I was in a place not so different from where you were when I found you. I wasn't homeless, but I was close. I was scraping by, working 3 jobs just to pay rent on a rundown apartment. My parents had died when I was young, and I had no one to turn to. The world didn't care about me, and I didn't care much for the world." Ethan listened intently, his curiosity growing with each word. "One day," Richard continued, "I was walking home after a long shift at a factory. It was raining, and I was soaked to the bone. As I passed by a diner, a man stepped out and called me over. He was older, dressed in a suit, and had a presence that commanded attention. He handed me an umbrella and said, 'You look like you could use some shelter.' I thought he was just being kind, but then he asked me to join him for coffee." Richard's lips curved into a faint smile, as if reliving the memory. That man was Charles Adler, one of the most successful businessmen in the city at the time. For reasons I still don't fully understand, he took an interest in me. Over the next few months, he mentored me, taught me about business, and gave me opportunities one never thought I'd have. But he never handed me anything on a silver platter. He made me work for it, made me prove I was worth the investment." Ethan leaned forward, captivated by the story. "So, you're doing for me what he did for you?" "Exactly," Richard said, his tone serious. "Charles believed in paying it forward. He told me that success is meaningless unless you use it to help others. I've built my empire, Ethan, but now it's time to focus on what comes next. I need someone to carry on what I've started. Someone who understands struggle, who values hard work, and who won't take this opportunity for granted." Ethan's eyes widened as the weight of Richard's words sank in. "You're saying you want me to take over for you?" "Not yet," Richard said, holding up a hand. "You're not ready for that. But I do want to prepare you for something greater. The tests I've given you so far have been about more than work or trust. They've been about character. And you've proven that you have it." The room fell silent for a moment, the crackle of the fireplace filling the space. Ethan struggled to process what he had just heard. The man who had given him a second chance wasn't just offering him a job. He was offering him a future. "I don't know what to say," Ethan admitted, his voice shaking slightly. "You don't have to say anything right now," Richard said, his tone softening. "Just keep showing up. Keep proving that you're capable. And when the time comes, you'll know what to do." Ethan nodded, a mix of gratitude and determination swelling in his chest. He had spent so long feeling like a failure, like someone who had nothing to offer the world. But Richard's words ignited a spark of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, he was meant for something more. Richard stood, signaling that the conversation was over. "Maria will show you to the next task," he said, his voice returning to its usual businesslike tone. "And Ethan's?" "Yes," Ethan said, rising to his feet. "Don't let me down." As Ethan left the library, his mind buzzed with possibilities. The weight of Richard's expectations was daunting, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time in years, he felt like his life had direction, like he was walking towards something instead of running away from it. Maria met him in the hallway, a knowing smile on her face. "Big talk?" she asked. "You could say that," Ethan replied, his voice still tinged with awe. "Good," Maria said, leading him toward his next task. "Richard doesn't open up to just anyone, you know. If he believes in you, that means you're special. Don't waste it." Ethan nodded, her words echoing Richard's. He was beginning to understand the gravity of what he had been given, and the responsibility that came with it. As he stepped into the next chapter of his journey, one thing was clear. This was no longer just about survival. It was about becoming the man he was meant to be. The days following Richard's revelation felt like a blur for Ethan. He was no stranger to hard work, but the tasks Richard assigned him now carried a weight they hadn't before. Each responsibility seemed larger, more impactful, and the expectations higher. Richard wasn't simply testing him anymore. He was shaping him, molding him into something Ethan wasn't sure he was ready to become. On this particular morning, Maria greeted Ethan with a folder in hand instead of her usual warm smile. "Mr. Harmon wants you to review this before you meet him in the conference room," she said, her voice more formal than usual. Ethan took the folder, his hands already clammy, and opened it to find a stack of papers filled with spreadsheets, contracts, and what looked like the plans for a community development project. "What's all this?" he asked, his brow furrowing. Maria's gaze softened, and her tone grew encouraging. "Richard will explain. Just know that this is important, Ethan. Very important." The conference room was a stark contrast to the warmth of Richard's study or the elegance of the library. It was a functional space, with a long glass table surrounded by high-backed chairs and a large screen mounted on the wall. Richard stood at the head of the table, reviewing a set of documents when Ethan entered. He looked up and gestured for Ethan to sit. "Morning," Richard said, his tone brisk. "I assume Maria handed you the folder." Ethan nodded, holding it up. "I looked through it, but I'm not sure I understand what it all means." "That's why you're here," Richard said, sliding a pen and notepad across the table toward Ethan. "I need you to take notes. We're meeting with the project leads in 15 minutes, and I want you to be prepared." "Project leads?" Ethan asked, his confusion growing. "For what?" Richard leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze locking onto Ethan's. "For a community initiative I've been working on. It's a redevelopment project in one of the city's most neglected neighborhoods. We're building affordable housing, a job training center, and a health clinic. The kind of support that can actually change lives." Ethan's breath caught. The scale of the project was staggering. "And you want me involved in this?" "I don't just want you involved," Richard said, his tone firm. "I want you to lead certain aspects of it." Ethan's heart raced. "Lead?" "Richard, I've never done anything like this before. I don't even know where to start." Richard's expression softened slightly. "That's why I'm here, to guide you. But you've already proven you have the heart and the determination to see this through. The rest is just learning, and you'll learn by doing." The meeting began promptly, with a team of architects, social workers, and financial analysts filing into the room. Ethan felt out of place at first, his worn clothes and uncertain demeanor standing in stark contrast to their polished appearances. But Richard's presence was a steadying force. As the team discussed budgets, timelines, and logistical hurdles, Ethan listened intently, jotting down notes and absorbing as much as he could. At one point, Richard turned to Ethan. "What do you think about the timeline for the job training center?" he asked, his voice calm but expectant. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. All eyes turned to him, and for a moment, he felt like an imposter. But then he remembered the countless people he had seen struggling on the streets, people who could benefit from a project like this. Taking a deep breath, he spoke. "I think it's ambitious," he said carefully, "but doable. If we focus on partnerships with local businesses, we might be able to speed up the process. They'd benefit from a trained workforce, and it would give the program credibility. The room fell silent for a beat before one of the analysts nodded. "That's a good point," she said. "We've been considering partnerships, but hadn't prioritized them." Richard smiled faintly, pride flickering in his eyes. "There you go," he said to Ethan. "You're starting to see the bigger picture." After the meeting, Ethan stayed behind as the team filed out. Richard approached him, his expression both stern and encouraging. "You did well," he said, "but this is just the beginning. Leading a project like this isn't about having all the answers. It's about finding them, about being resourceful and willing to learn." Ethan nodded, his confidence bolstered, but still fragile. "I'll do my best. That's all I ask," Richard said. "But remember, Ethan, this isn't just about the project. This is about you stepping into a role that requires strength, vision, and compassion. You have what it takes. I wouldn't have chosen you otherwise." Over the next few weeks, Ethan threw himself into the project. He met with local leaders, visited the neighborhood to speak with residents, and worked closely with the team to refine the plans. Each day brought new challenges: bureaucratic red tape, skeptical community members, and logistical setbacks, but Ethan faced them head-on, drawing on the lessons he had learned from Richard and his own experiences. One afternoon, while visiting the site of the future job training center, Ethan encountered an older man named Carl. Carl had lived in the neighborhood for over 40 years and was known as its unofficial historian. "So, you're the one trying to fix this place up," Carl said, his tone wary but not unkind. "I'm part of a team," Ethan replied. "But yes, we're trying to make things better." Carl leaned on his cane, his gaze piercing. "A lot of people have come through here promising change," he said. "Most of them leave before they make good on it. What makes you any different?" Ethan hesitated, then spoke from the heart. "Because I know what it feels like to be forgotten," he said. "To feel like the world has given up on you. I've been there, and I don't want anyone else to feel that way." Carl studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right," he said. "I'll give you a chance. But don't let us down." Back at the mansion, Ethan recounted the day's events to Richard, who listened with a mix of amusement and pride. "Carl's a tough one," Richard said. "If you've won him over, you're on the right track." "It's not just about winning people over," Ethan said. "It's about making sure we don't let them down. There's so much riding on this, Richard. What if I fail?" Richard's expression grew serious. "Failure is always a possibility," he said. "But it's not the end. It's what you do after you fail that matters. And from what I've seen, you have the resilience to keep going, no matter what." Ethan nodded, his determination renewed. As he left Richard's study that night, he felt the weight of the project more acutely than ever. But he also felt a growing sense of purpose, a belief that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Ethan arrived at the construction site for the job training center just as the sun began to rise, casting the city in shades of gold and pink. The sounds of hammers and drills filled the air as workers moved with purpose, their silhouettes illuminated by the morning light. The past few months had been some of the hardest and most rewarding of his life. As he stepped onto the site, he couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. This wasn't just a project anymore. It was a symbol of hope. The transformation of a neighborhood had been nothing short of remarkable. Once neglected streets were now bustling with activity. Families moved into newly renovated apartments. Children played in clean, safe parks, and the job training center stood as a beacon of opportunity for anyone willing to work for a better future. But the road to this moment had been anything but easy. Ethan's journey had been filled with obstacles. There were days when permits got delayed, funding fell through, or skeptics questioned whether the project would ever be completed. One particularly grueling week, a major sponsor pulled out, leaving a massive gap in the budget. Ethan had felt the weight of failure looming over him, but he refused to give up. Instead, he spent countless hours meeting with local businesses, pitching the project's value, and convincing them to invest in their own community. It wasn't just the practical challenges that tested him. It was the emotional ones, too. Ethan often found himself questioning whether he was the right person for this role. Who was he, a man who had once slept on park benches, to lead something so monumental? But every time doubt crept in, he thought of the people who depended on him. The single mother who could finally afford a decent apartment, the veteran who had found purpose through job training, the children who now had a place to play and grow. And then there was Richard. His guidance had been invaluable, but he had also been careful not to coddle Ethan. "This is your project," Richard would say whenever Ethan sought his advice. "I'm here to support you, but the decisions are yours to make." On this particular morning, Ethan was preparing for the grand opening of the Job Training Center, a culmination of months of hard work and collaboration. The event was set to be the largest gathering the neighborhood had seen in years. As Ethan walked through the site, checking on the final preparations, he spotted Carl, the older man who had initially been skeptical of the project. Carl stood near the entrance, leaning on his cane as he watched the workers put up the last of the decorations. Ethan approached him with a smile. "What do you think?" he asked, gesturing to the nearly completed center. Carl grunted, his expression unreadable. "It's better than I expected," he admitted gruffly. "But the real test will be whether it lasts." Ethan nodded, understanding the man's cautious optimism. "It will," he said with quiet confidence, "because it's not just about the building. It's about the people who will use it, and the people who build it." Carl's gaze softened slightly. "You've done good, kid," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As the morning turned into afternoon, the crowd began to gather for the opening ceremony. Residents, local leaders, and members of the press filled the area, their excitement palpable. Ethan stood near the stage, adjusting his tie nervously. Public speaking wasn't his strength, but Richard had insisted that this was his moment. "You've earned this," Richard had said earlier that week. "Own it." When it was time for him to speak, Ethan took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on him. For a moment, he hesitated, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what this day represented. But then he remembered why he was here. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "Thank you all for being here today. This center represents more than just bricks and mortar. It represents hope, opportunity, and resilience. It represents what can happen when a community comes together to support one another." He paused, scanning the crowd. "A year ago, I was in a very different place. I didn't have a home, a job, or a purpose. I felt invisible, like the world had given up on me. But then someone saw something in me, something I couldn't see in myself. That person gave me a chance, and it changed my life." Ethan turned toward Richard, who stood at the back of the crowd, his expression proud but humble. "That person is Richard Harmon," Ethan continued. "And today I want to thank him, not just for what he's done for me, but for what he's done for this community." The crowd erupted into applause, and Richard gave a small nod, his approval clear. Ethan waited for the noise to die down before continuing. "But this isn't just about one person's generosity. It's about what we can all achieve when we believe in each other. This center isn't the end of something, it's the beginning of a stronger, more connected community." As Ethan stepped down from the stage, the applause was deafening. People rushed to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him how much the project meant to them. For the first time, Ethan felt truly at peace with himself. He had found his purpose, and he had fulfilled it. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and the crowd dispersed, Ethan and Richard stood together in the quiet of the training center. The building, now lit from within, cast a warm glow over the street. "You did well today," Richard said, his voice filled with pride. "I had a good teacher," Ethan replied, his tone grateful. Richard chuckled softly. "You've come a long way, Ethan. But this is just the beginning. There's so much more you can do. So many more lives you can touch." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with determination. "I'm ready," he said, "for whatever comes next." Richard placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "I know you are." As they stood there, the sound of laughter and music drifting on the breeze, Ethan realized that this moment wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had believed in him, everyone who had supported him, and everyone who would benefit from what he had helped create. It was a legacy worth building, a legacy he would continue to honor for years to come. And now, I want to hear from you. Which part of this story touched your heart the most? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And of course, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more narratives like this. Each subscription helps us continue bringing exciting stories to you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.